In this video, we're going to symbolize 10 sentences that illustrate the basics of symbolization in the system of predicate logic. Off to the side here, we've got the fundamental elements. We've got the predicates, which are best thought of as properties. They're represented by all the capital letters A through Z. We have the names, lowercase letters a through W. They pick out individuals in the world. And then we've got the variables X, Y, and Z. Of course, we've got two new connectives. They're both called quantifiers. We have the universal quantifier, which is read for all X, and the existential, which basically stands for some, and it's read there is an X such that. Alright, well, here's our three sentences that we'll start with. First one says, all of the burly lumberjacks cut down trees and eat buttered scones with tea. Yes, a little bit of a reference there to Monty Python. The first question to ask yourself when you're doing symbolization and predicate logic, at least when you're in the initial stages and you're making the sort of distinctions we are for this class, is to ask yourself, is it a singular sentence, a universal, or an existential? Now, when you go on in logic, these things can be all mixed together, but for the moment, we're going to keep these separate. Singular sentences are about specific individuals, and for our purposes, they're usually going to be names. Things like Kermit and Janet and Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and anything that you can name. Of course, also things like Houston and Radiohead, etc. Universal sentences are about all things, all the frogs, all the philosophers, etc. And existential sentences are about some things. Of course, we know that for the purposes of predicate logic, some means at least one. So when you say some frogs are green, what you're actually saying is that there is at least one thing which is both a frog and green. So back to 23. What type of sentence is this? Singular, universal, or existential? Pretty obviously it's universal. We're talking about all the burly lumberjacks. Now notice, if you have a universal, there's a standard form here. And over again, when we have universal sentences, we're going to be using this form. So if you know you have a universal sentence, the thing to do is just get out the universal quantifier. The upside down A and the X, this pair is the quantifier. It is the connective. Now, we can change out this X. We could have a Y or a Z or even some other variable, and then you would read it differently. But when you're only going to need one variable, X is the one to go with. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that as soon as you recognize you have a universal, that you set up this framework in which to do your symbolization. Universals work a bit like tildes. They sit outside the parentheses to become the main connective for the whole thing. I'm going to suggest that you use brackets when you have longer sentences so that you visually see the structure more clearly. And then inside, in all standard universals, you would have an arrow. All that's left is for us to decide what's the antecedent and what's the consequent of the conditional inside the brackets. Well, here, it turns out that it helps if you know a little bit of grammar, because it turns out the subject will go before the arrow and the grammatical predicate will go after the arrow. We know that the concept of a predicate is different in logic and in grammar. A predicate in logic is a property. In grammar, it's the part of the sentence which contains the verb and tells you what's going on with the subject, something like that. Well, in most cases, we don't care about grammar and logic, but in this case we do. The subject of the sentence is burly lumberjacks, and that's what's going to go right here. How do you symbolize burly lumberjack? Well, it's an object that's burly, and it's an object that's a lumberjack. Since we're not talking about any named items, and since we have a quantifier in front, we're going to use the variable X to associate with this. We read this as X is burly and X is a lumberjack. And then what they're doing is cutting down trees and eating buttered scones with tea. Notice I'm not done because it's important that I get in some parentheses here. I have to group these properties and group these properties as well. Now, how do you read this sentence? I think it's a really valuable thing to, after you're symbolized, go back and think about what the sentence says. Read it to yourself, and it's a fantastic thing to do that and think about the world at the same time. The world, more technically thought of as the domain, is a model of what the sentence is talking about, is one way to put it. The world is the set of all the objects that exist. Janet and all the boxes of Jell-O and all the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, etc., etc. Everything is in here. And this sentence is making a statement about the world. What is it saying? Well, the quantifier is read for all x. So this is saying for all x. Then we have an if here because of the arrow. If x is Burley and x is a lumberjack, then x cuts down trees and x eats buttered scones with tea. So what the sentence is saying is go look in the world. If you find an object that has the Burley property and the lumberjack property, let's look around. Oh, look, that looks like a Burley lumberjack right there. If you find a Burley lumberjack, then if this is a true sentence, it's going to also have the cutting down trees and the eating buttered scones with tea property as well. Ah yes, sure enough, this clearly has those properties also. We've also talked about this in terms of sets. You can think of properties as sets. So one way to think about this is if you find something that's inside the Burley property, inside the Burley set, and it's also inside the lumberjack set, then, according to this sentence, it should be inside of the T set and also inside of the S set. Yes, the pictures can rapidly get very messy when you're dealing with multiple properties, but conceptually, the sentence letters, the predicate letters, identify properties, and the properties can be thought of as sets. One interesting point here. When you say that all of the Burley lumberjacks cut down trees, etc., are you implying the existence of Burley lumberjacks? Oftentimes in English one might think so, but according to logic, this sentence doesn't necessarily require that Burley lumberjacks exist. It says if Burley lumberjacks exist, then here's a couple properties that they have. I point this out because that's a significant difference between universals and existentials. Existentials always imply existence. That's why they're called existential. Universals don't. They say if something has a couple of properties, if something has a property, then it's going to have some other properties as well. Okay, let's get this out of the way here. Get rid of the world. And I think what we'll do with this sentence is let's just move it up northwards a ways. There we go. Now we can compare it to the next one. All right, the next sentence. It says, there are brave knights fighting rabbits while searching for the Holy Grail. I see I have a mark on here that is left over from my previous attempt, which I got frustrated and threw away. So this sentence, is it a universal, an existential, or a singular sentence? In fact, it is an existential. There is, there are, there exists. These are all synonyms for some in a logical perspective. Some means at least one. And what this sentence is saying is that there's at least one brave knight that fights rabbits and searches for the Holy Grail. Well, if you've got an existential, then you want to get out an existential quantifier. Existentials also sit outside parentheses. Notice the connective that existentials go with is an ampersand. Standard universals go with arrows, standard existentials go with ampersands. We see it over and over and over again. And again, the subject goes before the connective and the grammatical predicate goes afterwards. The subject here is brave knights. And so this is going to be BX, ampersand, KX. And then afterwards, we have fighting rabbits. That would be RX. While searching. While, of course, is a synonym for and so it's just saying and searching for the Holy Grail. What about parentheses? Do we need the same parentheses as above? The truth is, in this case, they're optional because notice we just ended up with a string of components connected by ampersands. So we can stop at this point. Let's read the sentence back and think about what it says about the world. It says, there is an X such that, and so what it's saying is there is at least one thing in the world. This is just the fancy standard way to say this. There is an X such that X is brave, and X is a knight, and X is fighting rabbits, and X searches for the Holy Grail. So you take a look in the world, and if this is a true sentence, there should be at least one object that has all those properties. I think that's it right there. It's a little tiny object. Of course, this sentence is also saying that that thing exists in the intersection of all four of the sets that correspond to these properties. But this one is really saying there is something there. That's why it's called an existential. All right, a standard universal and a standard existential, and let's contrast that with our next sentence, which says, when Plato dances, Socrates is embarrassed, unless Aristotle has spiked the punch. All right, kind of ridiculous sentence, but what type of sentence is it? This one is clearly singular. You can tell that immediately because we're talking about named individuals. Yes, as you go on in logic, you can run these things together, but in an introductory material, it's usually best to keep these separated, and that's what we're doing at present. A great way to do this is go through the sentence, rewrite it, and reduce it to the logical words, and then the relevant couplets that identify the simple sentences, and the punctuation. So when, of course, is a synonym for if. So when Plato dances, how do you symbolize Plato dances? That would be capital D, lowercase p. Plato dances. Comma, Socrates is embarrassed. Well, that'd be capital E, lowercase s. Unless, and so unless Aristotle has spiked the punch. That would be SA. When DP, ES, unless SA. If you can get this far, the rest of it is just propositional logic. Probably the hardest thing about this one is what do you want to do with unless? We have two strategies, the if not strategy and the or strategy. We know or is always easier, and I recommend that you use it. If I did that, all I really have to do for this sentence is if DP, then ES or SA. So if Plato dances, then Socrates is embarrassed, or Aristotle has spiked the punch. Now what about parentheses? Really amazing thing about an arrow followed by a wedge. Turns out it doesn't matter where you put them. You can put them like that. If Plato dances, then Socrates is embarrassed, or Aristotle has spiked the punch. Or you could put the parentheses afterwards. When Plato dances, then Socrates is embarrassed, or Aristotle has spiked the punch. Or is your friend. Turn unless into or, and it makes life really easy. If we did it the other way, as in if not, then we have to say if not. If Aristotle doesn't spike the punch, then Plato will dance. Then when Plato dances, then Socrates is embarrassed. This time, the parentheses have to go on the backside. No options. There is one other thing that would work, because what do we know is logically equivalent to this? Tilde SA, ampersand, DP, arrow, ES. And yes, it's also acceptable if you were doing this, you could put the DP first and then the tilde SA. Do I need to do that one as well? DP, arrow, tilde, SA, arrow, ES. This is getting really messy, and the parentheses are on the backside. There's lots of logical equivalencies. But notice what we're talking about right now, this is all propositional stuff. The new interesting things are really in the universal and the existential at the top. Okay, let's pause and let's get some more sentences. These next two sentences go together to make what I hope is a pretty obvious point. Every leprechaun who lives in Ireland has a pot of gold and wears a little green hat. That's obviously universal, right? So let's get out our universal quantifier, put in a couple of brackets. We know the main connective inside should be an arrow. What's the subject of the sentence? It's a leprechaun who lives in Ireland, and then what they're doing is they have a pot of gold and they wear a little green hat. So, leprechaun who lives in Ireland. Well, that would be things that have the leprechaun property and things that have the living in Ireland property. Need parentheses around that. And then they have the having a pot of gold property as well as the wearing a little green hat property. Alright, there's the symbolization. Really straightforward. Can we read it back? Read it along with me. For all x, if x is a leprechaun and x lives in Ireland, then x has a pot of gold and x wears a little green hat. Pretty straightforward, right? Let's compare it to the next one. It says every leprechaun who lives in Ireland and has a pot of gold wears a little green hat. Is the difference obvious? Clearly we've got another universal. It still goes with brackets. This time I'm going to move the arrow down though, because what's the subject of this sentence? The subject of this sentence is leprechaun who lives in Ireland and has a pot of gold. And then what they do, the grammatical predicate, is they wear a little green hat. I'm not really sure exactly how to tell you to see the difference here. I mean, notice it's very, very similar. There's an and here, but I think it's the type of thing you can read and you can see it. You can tell, look, here's the subject. It's a leprechaun who lives in Ireland and has a pot of gold. And then the verb in this sentence is wears. You can see I'm stumbling in trying to explain what's going on. But that's why I just present the two sentences and see, you get it, right? This makes sense. And I hope it does, because I have a very hard time explaining what the real difference is here. This is one of my favorite sentences. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down. In fact, it's the title of a Carpenters song from about 1973, I think. The ideal thing would be if a snippet of the song was to just start playing right now.
Talking to myself and feeling old. Sometimes I'd like to quit. Nothing ever seems to fit. Hanging around, nothing to do but frown. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down. What I've got they used to call.
The production values here are just astounding, aren't they? Alright, is this sentence singular, universal, or existential? Well, in fact, sometimes people get a little thrown by this because it's not an entirely standard-looking sentence. It is a universal. It would be easier to see that if it said all rainy days and Mondays get me down, but the always is kind of doing that work. Sometimes people see the word me and they say, well, wait, isn't me a name? Well, in fact, it can be. Me a name, I call myself. There's another song that we could have a snippet of. In this particular case, though, me is just part of the property of always getting me down, or just getting me down, I suppose is what I should say. And then sometimes people say, well, wait, isn't Monday a name? And you can think of Monday as the name of a day. If I said, last Monday I did X, I might be thinking of naming that particular day in the past. But in this case, we really want to just say, think of this as the property of being a Monday. And yes, that means what we're really doing here is the objects that we're talking about in the world, they're the days of the week. Anyway, this is a universal sentence. Let's get started. Universal quantifier. Get a set of brackets. We know that universals go with arrows. The subject of the sentence is rainy days and Mondays. How do you symbolize rainy days and Mondays? Virtually everyone would want to say, well, that means Rx and Mx. And then the consequent of this sentence inside the brackets is dx. But it turns out, as simple and obvious as this looks, there's actually a mistake here. And the mistake is this ampersand. Think about what this sentence means that we just symbolized. For all x, if x is rainy and x is a Monday, then x gets me down. But the sentence says rainy days and Mondays get me down. This says if x is rainy and it's a Monday. What's the difference? Well, it turns out that what this sentence is actually saying is that rainy Mondays get me down. It's days that have both of these properties. But that's not what we want to say. We want to say that the rainy days get me down if they're just rainy, or if they're just Monday, they get me down. And in fact, that's what we have to do. This ampersand has to be replaced with a wedge. Notice this isn't good news. The word and is going to have to be symbolized with a wedge in this case, and that's the type of thing which it's really easy to make mistakes with on tests. Now the truth is there's an alternative way to symbolize this sentence which does make sense of this and. You would use a universal, and then what you would do is say, if x is rainy, then it gets me down, and if x is a Monday, then it gets me down. These two formulas are logically equivalent to each other, and they're both 100% correct. But notice this puts a universal with an ampersand. That is non-standard, because in standard cases universals go with arrows. This isn't illegal, and either one of these is 100% correct. But it's kind of like you have to choose your poison. When you've got, here's the basic rule to be aware of, the basic issue to be aware of. When you have the word and in the subject of a universal, it will virtually always need to be symbolized with a wedge. I wish I could say every single time, but it's not quite that simple. What you really have to do is think about the properties and ask, well, am I ascribing both of these properties to the same thing? Or am I thinking about two potentially distinct categories? And that's definitely what we're doing in this case. Now, here's a question. Does this sentence include the rainy Mondays? And the answer is it does, because we know that the wedge is inclusive. So this covers the rainy days, the Mondays, and also the rainy Mondays. And in the subject of a universal is tricky. In fact, I suspect the best thing that we could do is look at another couple of sentences which aren't in the set we were just talking about, just to make this contrast really clear. Consider the following two sentences. All pirate mathematicians, I'll just abbreviate this maths, all pirate mathematicians drink whiskey. Versus, let's have our other sentence be, all pirates and mathematicians drink whiskey. Can you anticipate the difference between the symbolization of these two sentences? Got the same three predicates in all case, and they're both obviously universals. In the first one, we are going to say, for all x, if x is a pirate and x is a mathematician. That's what a pirate mathematician is. Then they have the whiskey drinking property. So the ampersand goes with pirate mathematician. But in the other sentence, we are going to say if you're a pirate or if you're a mathematician, then you drink whiskey. It is kind of interesting to think about the world here. Well, do I have space to put in the world? When I'm talking about the pirates and the mathematicians, let's put in the two sets. And we'll just make a standard Venn diagram to compare this here. Here are the pirates, here are the mathematicians. When I say that all the pirate mathematicians drink whiskey, who am I talking about? That group right there. But when I'm talking about all the pirates and the mathematicians, now who am I talking about? It's the entire set of both. And of course it does include the intersection. So, pirate mathematicians, pirates and mathematicians, and lots of whiskey. All of these guys drink whiskey, according to the second sentence. So there's the whiskey drinkers. Okay, just a couple more sentences. Well, these last four sentences are really about the difference between singular, universal, and existential. In a sense, they're especially simple sentences. On the other hand, notice I put diamonds in front of them because they're not the sort of thing that I typically put on the test that covers the material we're talking about. I like for the sentences that we're symbolizing at this point, for the most part, to have really obvious names and to have explicit quantifiers, and I'm not trying to trip people up. These four sentences, though, they invite you to ask about the difference between singular, universal, and existential, and I think it's a good exercise to go through and think about them. So let's put the world up here. Always convenient to have the world handy. And let's talk about these four sentences. Number 29. A turtle is a reptile. Is that singular, universal, or existential? The thing to ask yourself, is it talking about all turtles? Or is it talking about at least one turtle? Or is it talking about some specific turtle that you could point at and say, well, see, it's that one right there. A turtle is a reptile. It's really talking about all turtles, right? And so 29 would just be symbolized for all x, if tx, then rx. For all x, if x is a turtle, then x is a reptile. A turtle is a reptile. But contrast that with number 30. A turtle bit my finger. Is that singular, universal, or existential? Well, it's clearly not universal, right? I'm not saying all turtles bit my finger. But is it singular or existential? Think about the difference. If it's existential, then all I'm saying is, well, there was at least one turtle that bit my finger. But if it's singular, well, then I can point to it and I can say, well, see, it was that damn turtle right there that bit my finger. A turtle bit my finger is actually existential because I'm not pointing to a particular one and saying, see, it was that one right there. I'm just saying there was a turtle. There was at least one creature that has the turtle property and the bit my finger property. So it's an existential, and we put in tx ampersand fx. There is an x. X is a turtle, and x bit my finger. 31. The turtle is a peculiar creature. Does that mean all turtles are peculiar? Or does it mean there is a peculiar creature? Or there is at least one turtle that's peculiar? Or does it mean that particular turtle is peculiar? And this time, it's again universal. We are saying for all x, if x is a turtle, then x is peculiar. Whoops, I've got creature capitalized, so that should have been a C. Pretend it was a C to begin with. And finally, number 32, the turtle slept on a log. Notice the capitalization is kind of giving it away here. This time, I do want to say that this is a singular sentence. The turtle. Notice the difference between a turtle and the turtle. When you say a turtle, that's an indefinite determiner, and it's just saying, well, there was one. There was at least one. But when you're saying the turtle, that isn't a way of sort of pointing at a particular one and saying, well, see, it was that one right there. And so how would you symbolize the sentence? It would be capital L, lowercase t, and basically we're using the words the turtle as sort of a stand-in for a name. The turtle slept on a log. The words this and that are kind of interesting in logic. This and that sort of act as perfectly generic names. When I say this, it's a sort of a way of picking out a particular object and giving it a name, so to speak. So if you said, this turtle slept on a log, that would definitely be a singular sentence. And the turtle slept on a log is working in a very similar way. All right, well, good luck with the symbolization. I hope the video has been useful.